Ike Pappas in Washington, Bernard Kalb in Washington, Robert Barr in Atlanta, Chris Kelly in River Falls, Wisconsin, Sharon Lovejoy in Kokomo, Indiana, and Terry Drinkwater in Seattle.
Good evening. In South Vietnam today, a ghastly chapter was added to the pathos of war that has gripped that country for the past 30 years. A huge C5 Air Force cargo plane carrying 243 South Vietnamese orphans to the United States, the first in the government-ordered airlift, crashed in a rice paddy near Saigon just minutes after takeoff. More than half the children and as many as 40 of the 62 escorts and crew aboard were killed. Murray Fromson reports.
The orphans airlift was considered a victory over red tape. It took an order from President Ford to dispatch the C5A to Saigon. Then the agreement of Vietnamese authorities to expedite passports and exit visas for the orphans. Some of those put aboard the plane had been born only weeks ago. Most seemed to be between the ages of 2 and 8. Some sat along the side of the plane. Others were strapped to the floor, more terrified of the television lights than their first trip in an airplane. Wives of American officials being evacuated home with their own children agreed to act as chaperones to the orphans. Destination, the West Coast, and then onward to American families who had already begun the adoption process. 2 hours ago, I watched this airplane take off from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. It was a perfect takeoff, carrying those orphans to the United States. What can one say except, when will the misery in this country ever stop? The huge plane crashed into a field about 5 miles from the end of the runway, near a small village in Gia Dinh province. There were pieces of wreckage scattered across a half a mile of rice paddy. A fire was slowly burning itself out near the engines. Smashed bodies or parts of them were uncovered by Vietnamese Air Force crews and American officials who rushed to the scene. It was like a combat operation. Helicopters hovered overhead. Body bags were used to remove corpses for identification purposes. A hand here, a head there, shirts, books, diapers, all too grotesque to describe further. Vietnamese soldiers stood guard and said nothing. Villagers watched from a nearby railroad crossing. Other helicopters came back to Tan Son Nhut Air Base, where the ill-fated trip had begun. American and Vietnamese volunteers removed some of the body bags and other bodies wrapped in white sheets. Scores of ambulances rushed survivors to a nearby hospital. Some of the chaperones were in a state of shock. Moments before, they had been happy to be leaving Saigon.
Here, this way.
The orphans were to be the first of 2,000 to be airlifted out of Vietnam. Many were mixed blood, the children of Vietnamese women and black American GIs. They would never have had a chance for happiness in Vietnam, where racial prejudice is as strong as in any other country. Now, they have no chance at all. Murray Fromson, CBS News, in Gia Dinh province.
Latest figures from Saigon indicate that at least 178 persons were killed. It was not clear how many American wives and their children were among the dead. The pilot, not seriously hurt, survived. At the Pentagon, there is increasing speculation that sabotage may have been involved in that tragic crash. Ike Pappas reports now on the Pentagon's explanation of just what happened.
The C-5 Galaxy is the world's largest airplane. It's almost as long as a football field. Its wingspan is over 222 feet. Its tail is tall as a 6-story apartment house. Its cargo doors cover a 19-foot wide opening. It was these doors that blew off the C-5 that departed Tan Son Nhut today. The Pentagon offered these details of the crash. As the plane passed through 23,000 feet, it experienced a massive explosive decompression. The pilot said he thought the rear cargo doors had blown off and a cargo ramp had blown out of the aircraft. At the same time, the plane's elevator, rudder, and flap controls were knocked out and some hydraulic pressure lost. Using the plane's aileron and throttles, the pilot managed to turn the craft around and to head back to Tan Son Nhut. 7 miles out at 5,000 feet and with the field in sight, the plane, gears down, made its final approach, but it sank, and the pilot was forced to try an emergency landing in a rice paddy only 5 miles from the runway. The plane made a smooth touchdown, but then bounced over a river and into another rice paddy. As it touched down a second time and began to bounce again, the wings ripped off and a fire broke out. The plane then began to disintegrate. The Air Force does not know what caused the plane to crash. It says an investigation is underway. Pentagon sources say no possibility is being ruled out. Some Air Force officials believe the plane was sabotaged. But critics of the C-5 said it was unsafe for passengers to travel, that it did not have enough emergency exits, and that the wings were weak. The Air Force does admit it is considering a multi-million-dollar contract to correct structural defects in the C-5. Meanwhile, the Pentagon says that the plane would continue to be used in the orphan airlift. Ike Pappas, CBS News, Washington.
Pentagon experts' concern about sabotage was fed by their doubts that a blown cargo door could have caused fatal damage to the plane's controls. President and Mrs. Ford had planned to meet that doomed flight when it reached the United States. Mr. Ford issued a statement saying he was deeply saddened by the crash and vowing that, quote, our mission of mercy will continue. The president added that the survivors of the crash will be flown to the United States when they are physically able. And Mr. Ford added, other waiting orphans will make the journey. As if to emphasize his words, Pan American World Airways announced plans for a special airlift from Saigon tomorrow of 400 orphans and 50 adult attendants.
Look at her. You know that we've been married almost 17 years. 2 kids, great kids. My wife is really something.
Well, I try to be the best wife and mother I can be, but to do that, you have to take good care of yourself. And one thing I do every day is take a Geritol tablet to make sure I get the iron and vitamins I need.
Geritol, more than twice the iron of any ordinary supplement and some very important vitamins.
Honey, I love you.